This truly is an opportune time to begin this series on the document on dignity, because it's the day after our festive celebration of the feast of St. Louis Marie de Montfort. And as we noted yesterday, one of the remarkable and important characteristics of his ministry was the way he privileged the direction of his energies toward those who were most readily overlooked and neglected in society. In fact, going so far as to identify the most destitute as his particular friends. We told the story of when families would invite Father de Montfort to their home for dinner, he would say, "I accept if I can bring a friend." And they would say, "Sure, Father." And he would show up with one of the beggars from the street. And he'd say, "I am here with my colleague, my coworker, my friend. I'm glad you are welcoming us." But just a remarkable insistence on recognizing the God-given dignity of everyone, beginning with those in whom that dignity was least obvious. Sir? Welcome. Well, if we're going to talk about the document, it helps to have a copy of the document in front of us. So, as I said, feel free to mark them up. We're not going to read line by line through the document. That's usually not the most helpful way of doing it. But what we want to do is just orient and frame this very important statement of authoritative teaching that came out. In fact, in the introductory section to the document, there's a description of the process by which it came together. It's a document that has been in the works for 5 years. That is a long time in terms of preparing a statement. So pre-pandemic, in 2019, there was a recognition on the part of what was then called the Congregation for Doctrine and Faith that there needs to be an authoritative clarification of the real dignity of the human person into this confused, troubled modern world in which we find ourselves. And so work began 5 years ago. And over that time, various versions of the document were put together. And essentially what is summarized in the introduction as it describes that process was there was a recognition on the one hand that while the teaching needed to be very, very clear, it also didn't need to be overwhelming in its quantity. In other words, there was a choice being made for a very practical document, which would be an articulation of normative teaching accompanied by a direct address of a number of specific issues which the church would call grave violations of human dignity. And so very much a practical document. You know, it would have been one thing to have a lengthy philosophical statement and pages of theological reflection, but what was eventually decided upon was something that would be more accessible, especially for the average well-educated believer, where what we want is something that can clearly articulate what the church is teaching, but then also help us think about and look at how to navigate a number of issues that are current in the world around us. When a couple Sundays ago, when I first spoke about the document here at the shrine, I did it in the context of the homily at Mass and St. Peter's statement in Jerusalem, that initial proclamation of the gospel, "This Jesus whom you crucified, God has raised up and made Messiah and Lord." And hidden in that statement is the memory of the events of the Passion. And during the Passion of the Lord, when he was on trial, and again, what is a trial? It is a public action. And so even the private conversations between Jesus and Pilate, they have a public character about them. And the trial of the Lord took place very publicly. There was a crowd gathered around the praetorium. And we hear that at one point in the trial, the Lord has been beaten, even though he's been declared innocent. And so if we just think through that, he's innocent, but we're going to beat him because innocence doesn't matter. He's inconvenient. Jesus wasn't condemned to death because he was guilty of anything. He was condemned to death because he wasn't worth saving. And so he's innocent and he's beaten. And after he's beaten, now again, consider that. When someone is beaten viciously, the body is marred. One has trouble standing up straight. There's a sense of weakness, and one beats something that is not important. One doesn't treat a human being that way. You have to begin thinking of somebody as other than a human being to really do that. And so what's the reaction? The soldiers who value strength and status weave a crown of thorns, put it on his head, throw a cloak on his shoulders, and turn him into a laughingstock. An object of mockery is not one that I am according any dignity to. Because if I was recognizing any dignity, I wouldn't be laughing. I wouldn't be mocking. So so with regard to the issue of human dignity, just think about that for a second. Because what happens, as St. John recounts it in his gospel, is disturbingly common in human history. After all of this has happened to the Lord, he has been beaten, he has been humiliated, he has been turned into a laughingstock. Pilate brings him out in front of the people. The crown of thorns is on his head. His body is beaten and bruised. There's no recognizable beauty about him. And what does Pilate say? Look at him. Behold the man. Look at the laughingstock. Look at the weakling. Look at the ridiculous one who is here. That moment, the ecce homo. Behold the man. And what is the crowd's reaction when they behold him? Crucify him. We want nothing to do with him. He's obviously not good enough for us. Away with him, be rid of him. But note how in the middle of all of that is this disappearance of the visible aspect of his personal dignity. It makes it easy to reject. And in no small measure, it's one of the reasons the church has long had a devotion to this moment, the ecce homo, and the contemplation of the wounded, ridiculed face of Christ, through which we come to see the fullness of the glory of God and the love of God. In fact, in many churches, the custom was at the beginning of the Stations of the Cross would be an ecce homo, a behold the man, Jesus the prisoner, Jesus the rejected one. We behold him, we go right to the condemnation, but then we pass through all of the terrible steps of the crucifixion, which again is a death designed to humiliate. Not just the one who is killed, but all of those who know him. The crucifixion for Rome was a public action as well. It wasn't simply an execution, it was an event. The whole movement through the streets of town with the cross was designed so that everyone could see. And it would rob the condemned one of the last vestiges of his respect. And it would be a reminder to the people that should you challenge Rome, this will be you. He's taken outside of the city, and the crucifixion took place near a road. Why? So that it would be seen. And those who are crucified by the road, naked, hanging in their pain, again, completely undignified, completely humiliated, and a symbol to the conquered people. This waits for you if you challenge us. And that's why it was such a brutally long form of execution. Often it took more than a day for those who were hung on crosses to die, because they died by suffocating, by losing the ability to breathe, not by blood loss. And so over that long time, you have this spectacle of one who has no dignity dying in the public eye, and a group of people receiving the message, this is what we will do to you, should you challenge us. And so again, there's this element of what happens in the crucifixion that relates directly to this teaching that the church is articulating. It's important that we see that, that this is not just addressing modern problems. Rather, it actually gives us a lens that's even helpful to, as we contemplate the mysteries of the Lord, to really understand some things that we might miss otherwise. And so it is then, at the end of the Stations of the Cross in many churches, we behold the man again. And it's the image of the risen Lord, whose glory shines through, and his true dignity rises up out of the ashes of his woundedness to reveal the true face of goodness. And so again, hidden, and what does that also reveal? Hidden in this face is the glorious face of the Son of God. Hidden in that apparent indignity is a glory and a greatness that the world could not recognize. So that having been said, we then turn to the document. Does everybody have a copy? The document itself is not very long. It's only about 22 pages. And it is 4 chapters or 4 sections. The longest of the 4 sections is the last one. And it's a discussion of what the Church and what Pope Francis refers to as grave violations of human dignity. So the longest single part of the document is that practical part that we alluded to. The Holy Father was insistent, if we're putting a statement about the dignity of the human person out, we have to address the way that dignity becomes violated. And we have to take a hard look at the many different ways that that dignity is violated. But before we can do that, we have to articulate what the true dignity of the human person is, and where it is found, where it comes from, and what it implies. Because if we get that wrong, we won't get the things in the back part of the document right. We'll just be adding to the confusion of a world that doesn't understand this properly because it doesn't understand itself properly. And so what we'll do then is, today we'll talk about unpacking then what the Church has to say about the dignity of the person. That teaching about the dignity of the person then implies a response, a way of living that should come out of that. We'll talk about that next week. So in other words, this is not simply a didactic statement, this is what we mean when we say dignity. There's also then this is the implication for Christian living. And that impacts prayer, that impacts moral choices, that impacts the use of our freedom. And so we want to take some time with that. And then weeks 3 and 4, we'll take some time going through the back part of the document. Since that's the long part and where we're likely to have more questions and more discussion, we'll do that over 2 weeks rather than try to rush it. And then we have a 5th week to try and put any pieces together and then to clear up any lingering questions that we might have. So that's the rough framework for where we're going. And so as we move through the introduction, one of the things as well that is mentioned is that there is a teaching context for the document. One is the Holy Father's most recent encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, All Our Brothers. And that is where he sounds a particular keynote on this teaching of dignity and raises it to a particular importance. But he does it as a continuation of a trajectory that runs through the papacies of Paul VI, St. John Paul II, and Benedict XVI. There's been a movement toward clarifying and articulating an authentic statement on the dignity of the human person, especially in light of modern confusion that has run through the modern papacies. And the document itself then is going to reference Paul VI. It's going to reference St. John Paul II. It's going to reference Benedict XVI, and it's going to reference Francis. But it is not simply a statement of teaching unique to Pope Francis. Rather, it's a statement that brings together a whole trajectory that has been running through the papacy for the last 60 years. And again, it's important to recognize that. And talk about beginning in a strong way. If you turn on to the second page where it says introduction, that is actually where the statement itself begins. Okay? So the explanatory preamble is the first almost 2 pages. When we hit to the section that says introduction, that's the actual beginning of the document. Dignitas Infinita, infinite dignity, is the translation of that. Infinite dignity. Every human person possesses an infinite dignity, inalienably grounded in his or her very being, which prevails in and beyond every circumstance, state, or situation the person may ever encounter. At first glance, that seems like a simple restatement of what we grow up learning. Every life is sacred, every human person has dignity, and yet there's an addition here that is the cornerstone of the document, and it is this. This infinite dignity prevails in and beyond every circumstance, state, or situation in which the person may find himself. In other words, it's a dignity that cannot be lost and cannot be taken away. That is very important. If you take nothing else in terms of the key element of the teaching, take that. That the inalienable dignity intrinsic to the human person cannot ever be lost. There is no sickness. There is no moral failing. There is no social situation. There is no poverty so great that it can take that dignity away. Everything that the document says is going to flow right from that, and it's going to be at the service of unpacking that. Because we live in a world where dignity is often held to be contingent. You know, we live in a world where we think, if I can't contribute to society, I have no value. We live in a world that wants to talk about dignity in terms of my ability to think and decide and to act. And so what does that say about the mentally ill or the mentally impaired? Note, these are all ways the world talks about the dignity of the person. And note the danger in them. There's often a way that that dignity can be removed, taken away. If it's subject to me recognizing something about you other than that you're a human being, it can be taken away. It can be lost. I don't have to give it to you. And so the church is beginning this statement with a shot across the bow. The dignity of the human person is both infinite and enduring. This principle, and again, the next shot across the bow, which is fully recognizable even by reason alone. In other words, you shouldn't need faith to come to this conclusion. If you rightly apply reason to the mystery of human existence, you see that there's something irreducibly dignified, irreducibly good and great about a human person, regardless of what he or she is capable of doing, regardless of what he or she has done, regardless of whether he or she is sick, regardless of whether or not he or she is accepted by anyone else. There is something fundamental about what it is to be human that is always to be respected. And now note, we're not talking about the value of the human person. We're talking about the dignity of the human person, and that's a very conscious word choice on the part of the church. Value is an economic term. Value implies gain. Value implies preserving something. And it's not wrong to talk about the value of life, but value has a transactional note about it. Dignity demands respect. If I recognize dignity about you, I will respect you. Note how that works? Dignity demands respect. This is not simply valuing another, it is respecting. And there are many things that are valuable that we don't respect. Dignity demands respect. In the light of Revelation, the Church resolutely reiterates and confirms the ontological dignity of the human person created in the image and likeness of God and redeemed in Jesus Christ. From this truth, the Church draws the reasons for her commitment to the weak and those less endowed with power, always insisting on the primacy of the human person and the defense of his or her dignity beyond every circumstance. That is one heck of a first paragraph. That is one heck of a first paragraph. But note how the church now is going to say, there's a reason why we care for the poor, and it's not just because they're needy. We recognize the dignity of their lives. And that dignity demands our respect. Note how powerful that is. Because again, there are all kinds of charity that can be demeaning to the person who receives it. If I lead with, "Oh, poor you," know what I've already done? I've already diminished you in some way. Even though I'm going to extend a hand to help you, I've diminished you even as I do that. But when I recognize the fundamental dignity that you have, I won't condescend in that way. I will want to help you, but in a way that allows you as well to recognize that you're valued. And that's very, very important. And so note what the church is saying here, that a constitutive part of how we work rests on the foundation of being able to see the infinite and fundamental dignity of the human person. Going further, we're going to jump down to paragraph number 5, because, again, the document just wants to address some tendencies in the world as it begins synthesizing the idea of the dignity of the person. On another occasion, speaking to economists, Pope Francis stated that the economy and finance do not exist for their own sake. They are only an instrument or means. Their sole end is the human person and his or her total fulfillment in dignity. This is the only real capital. and its right to safeguard it. But an interesting definition of capitalism. The real capital is the dignity of the human person. That's the capital that we want to protect. That's the capital that we want to safeguard. That is the capital that we want to be responsible for. All of these other things, good as they are simply tools to be used for that purpose. And so note, the church is also saying that, how we live together and how we organize ourselves as a society matters. This is not a matter of wading into politics. It's simply saying, however we're going to look at the question, the moral imperative to safeguard the dignity of the human person cannot be absent from that conversation, cannot be absent from that decision making. Many decisions can be made in the light of that, but decisions that are made in some other light are not going to be the right ones. It's a powerful, powerful statement about if we really are serious about this, then it has to be in front of our eyes. And we have to learn how to begin looking and considering life and the world around us through that lens. And so as that happens, then, we want to turn to paragraph number 7, which is one of the more important articles in the document. And note the heading over the top of it, a fundamental clarification. Okay, so this is where, all right, now let's wade into the confusion and let's start clearing it up. There is widespread agreement today on the importance and normative scope of human dignity and on the unique and transcendent value of every human being. There's a lot of lip service paid to all of this. However, the phrase, the dignity of the human person, risks lending itself to a variety of interpretations that can yield potential ambiguities. In other words, it's a surprisingly fuzzy term. And again, our world loves that fuzziness, because if things are vague, I can be content with my own vagueness. If things are vague, I can camp out in an area which might not be so healthy, but there's no benchmark that allows me to recognize that. I don't have to leave there. If things are vague, I never have to make a real commitment to anything. And so the church now wants to talk about, let's have a look at what human dignity is. And note how it continues. And contradictions that lead us to wonder whether the equal dignity of all human beings is truly recognized, respected, protected, and promoted in every situation. And so note, when we get fuzzy on this, the dignity of somebody is going to be left out. The dignity of somebody is going to be diminished in somebody else's eyes. Sooner or later, we'll have a situation in which it's permissible to respect some, but not all. And so this is why the church is so concerned. This brings us to recognize the possibility of a fourfold distinction of the concept of dignity. Ontological dignity, moral dignity, social dignity, and existential dignity. And so what the church is doing now is, under this heading of the dignity of the human person, the church is going to say full human dignity has 4 elements to it: ontological, moral, social, and existential. Of those 4, they are not equal. Okay? These are not 4 equal elements that add up to one human dignity, one of the four elements is much more important than the other three. And that's the first one, the ontological dignity of the human person. Ontology is the science of being. So in other words, if we talk about an ontological dignity, it's something that you have simply for being a human being. It comes with your humanity. There is no humanity without it. Part of what it is to be human is to have this form of dignity, the ontological element. That's the piece that can never be taken away from anybody. It endures, it is permanent across all situations, all circumstances. Nothing can take it away. If I have a human person, this is there. Doesn't matter if it's a good person or a bad person in my judgment, this infinite dignity is, in fact, always present. So the other three forms are more conditional. And this is a helpful discussion that the Church engages in here, because most of our world wants to camp out in the conditional forms of dignity, which means dignity can be given and dignity can be taken away, which means dignity can be seen in some, but not necessarily in all, because it's conditioned on something. But the minute we talk about the real dignity of a human person being conditional, well, then we really are talking about some lives being more valuable than others, some people being more valuable than others. And that's one of the reasons the Church now wants to engage this. So now it's going to say, let's take a look at all of these things. We'll do most of our time today talking about the ontological aspect. So we're going to jump a little bit down to look at the other three for a moment, just to see what they consist in, okay? In the first paragraph, it's paragraph number 7, there's the mention of the ontological dignity and then the moral dignity of the human person. And when we speak of moral dignity, we refer to how people exercise their freedom. Note, moral dignity does not consist in the fact that I exercise my freedom. It exists in the way I exercise my freedom. In other words, if I have a rightly formed conscience that I follow, I will be increasing my moral dignity, because I am freely moving to live in a dignified way. If I act against my conscience, if I freely choose to do what is wrong, I will be diminishing my moral dignity. And so note, we can rightly speak of some lives as being less dignified on a moral level than others. And we know this. We experience how wicked behavior somehow cheapens the quality of the character of a person. And so note that there is an element of dignity which is directly related to our moral character. So there's an element of that dignity that can be lost. There's an element of that dignity where we can speak of greater or lesser based on the quality of the use of one's freedom. That also implies that a person actually has the ability to truly use their freedom. And that is an unequal reality around the world. But note then, so I have an ontological dignity just because of who I am as a human being. But who I am as a human being also has the capacity to choose and to decide and to act. And I can act in a way that is dignified, or I can act in a way that lacks dignity. So that's the moral element of dignity. And right away, we can see, however, if that is the only form of dignity, if the only form of dignity is how I shape my character by my actions, we can see very quickly then how those who commit certain choices can be rejected as having no value at all, no goodness at all. Note how, and again, and that it's a trap that many can fall into. Next, then, the church is going to speak about two other forms of dignity, social and existential. And when the church speaks about social, it's not speaking about how we get along with others, okay? That's part of moral dignity. Rather, it's recognizing that every human life is lived in a social set of circumstances. And those circumstances matter. And so, for example, the church is going to say, some people are going to be in a social setting where they're born into a reasonably well-to-do, comfortable family. They'll grow up in a relatively safe area, receive a good education, and have many possibilities in front of them. And so socially, they are in a setting where their personal dignity can be enhanced, can be embraced, and their freedom can be readily exercised. Others, however, may be born into such squalid and terrible poverty, have no access to education, minimal access even to basic things like clean drinking water, where all of a sudden they are in a setting which in no small measure doesn't rise to the fundamental dignity of a human person. And so we would talk of a lack of social dignity, not because of the person's fault, but because of the circumstances in which he or she is caught and cannot escape. And so again then, the church is going to want to talk about poverty and other conditions as dangerous and harmful, not simply because people lack necessities, but because of the way they mar our ability to recognize and to live true human dignity, because of what they do against the dignity of the human person. So again, when we talk about social dignity, it is not a dignity that society applies. It is it is a matter of the setting in which one is living his or her life. And we don't have to look very far to see this. You'll see this change even happen, unfortunately, here in the developed world in times of economic stress. Somebody suddenly loses a job and can't afford to live where I've been living. There's an economic crisis, and all of a sudden living conditions change. The ability to be present to my family changes because now I'm working longer hours for meager pay. And things begin to crumble around us. That is a change in the social dignity of the person. In the same way, someone can find his or her situation socially having improved, and it does bring about the ability to live in a more dignified way. Everything isn't at risk anymore. And so the church wants to highlight this. Economic, social realities around us do have an impact on the dignity of the person. And again, more than simply practically meeting needs, the church is concerned about that, about the dignity of those who are in these situations. One of the interesting things, just even as we just play with the news, is with the phenomenon of mass migration that we're seeing around the world and how difficult it is to even come up with solutions and ways of constructively addressing that. One of the problems is the numbers are so great that it produces a certain facelessness about it. It's this rushing sea of need and desperation, and sometimes it can be hard to remember that these are particular human beings that are on the move. It becomes easy to just miss that because the scale is so overwhelmingly vast. And this is one of the reasons then the church is pointing this out. It's not just that these are situations of lack of physical necessities. There is a lack of the ability to live according to one's human dignity here, and that becomes a problem. And then finally, it speaks of existential dignity. And when it speaks of existential dignity, it means the particular concrete details of your life right now. So we are all alive right now. We all exist right now at this moment. The existential dignity of the person is not about how you've always lived. It's about how are you right now. And so, for example, right now I am healthy. A week from now, I might not be. A week from now, I might receive a terrible medical diagnosis, and the condition might advance rapidly, and all of a sudden, my body is losing its ability to function. My mind is not as clear as it was. That's not a social reality. That's a personal reality. Something has happened to me. You know, I'm in a car accident, and my back is badly hurt. And I am going to be confined to a bed in a rehab center for a lengthy period of time, perhaps without anybody coming to visit me. Existential dignity. And so note, as we live, every single person, his or her existential dignity changes as he or she goes through life. You know, we begin as helpless, unborn infants in the womb. We are born into a certain situation, but we're still fairly helpless. We grow towards adulthood and we have more agency. We can do things. Just note the changes. We become less explicitly dependent on others, less helpless, and so we have our own agency. But then we age. And what happens? The body doesn't work the way it used to. The mind doesn't remember what it used to, perhaps for good, perhaps for bad. We lose the ability to contribute the way we would like. And we experience that diminishment. And we can experience that as well as a loss of value, a loss of dignity. And so when the church is speaking about these things, you know, it wants to put on the table. These are real aspects of human dignity, but they're not the only aspects. Because note how all three of these can change. It's a dignity that can be given, a dignity that can be taken away. Because it's based on what I can do or what I'm going through, whether I'm suffering or not. That's all contingent. And so there is an element of dignity that is contingent. All too often, the world wants to make decisions based on that contingency. You know, that's why there are arguments for things like assisted suicide. You know, that terrible statement, death with dignity. And the church is going to address exactly that statement in section 4. And it's basically going to say, you already have dignity. Let's start there. But note the difference. Note the difference. If all I see are these contingent aspects of dignity, and that's how I'm going to make my decisions and my moral reasoning, sooner or later someone gets condemned to death. Let's just be blunt. Sooner or later someone is damaged. Sooner or later it happens. And this is why the church wants to draw that hard line about an intrinsic dignity. And the heart then of the teaching in the first two parts of the document is now, what do we mean about this dignity, this intrinsic dignity of the human person? Is everybody following me so far? Anybody need a nap? Okay. And so to begin teasing that out, you know, it's not a bad idea when we have documents like this from the church to have a Bible nearby. Because one of the things that the church is going to do is it's going to quote the scriptures. Sometimes it will quote the full passage. Other times it's just going to make a reference and then just say, basically, and in the Bible that's where we find this. And so it can be helpful from time to time to be able to look it up. The single most important passage of Scripture for this document is one that is very familiar to us. It's found in chapter 1 of the book of Genesis, verses 26 and following. And then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. The church has long reflected on this verse from the book of Genesis. And the fruit of those centuries of reflection is expressed in this document. But note what it says. Human life is not accidental, and it never was. Human life is the product of divine agency and divine action. Human life is positively willed by God. Every human life. And this will be the church's position. There is no such thing as an accidental human life. There is no such thing as a human life that is not positively willed by God. And there is no such thing as a human life that has not been made in the image of God. That is intrinsic to every human being, regardless of race, regardless of culture, regardless of economic status, political status, regardless of mental faculty or capability, regardless of faith. Prior to all of that, every single human being has an aspect of the image of God in him or her. That is the ontological dignity of the human person. That's where it starts from. And so note, male and female are in the image of God. And that's important too. One gender is not preferred over another. What is common is that all human beings are created in the image of God and after his likeness. Next week, we're going to talk about that after his likeness line, which again, across the centuries, the theologians of the church have been fascinated by, especially the ancient fathers. And and would develop beautiful theologies of the human person as being made in the image and growing into the likeness. And what a marvelous description of the task of human growth and human maturing. To grow, in a sense, out of the image of God into the full likeness of God. And it's a marvelous, marvelous vocation. But the church is going to start there. Intrinsic to simply being a human being. And so note, it doesn't matter whether you've lost your mental faculties. The image of God is still there. It doesn't matter that you committed a horrible crime. The inmate on death row is still in the image of God. It doesn't matter that I can't see the unborn child in the womb. The image of God is there. And note how it doesn't matter how terrible the illness. The image of God is there. But as the church is doing all of this, it wants to bring all of these disparate things together. Because if I can't see and recognize the dignity and the value of the person in front of me, let's be honest, I'm not going to be so quick to recognize the dignity and the value of the unborn child. I'm not going to be so quick to recognize the dignity and the value of the person on the other side of the world. And so this learning to see the inherent dignity, especially of the one who's right in front of me, is something that the church wants to call our attention to call our minds to. But the church is going to go further, and it's going to say the dignity of the human person, great as it is actually intensified by Jesus Christ. And this is important for us. And why and how is it intensified? Jesus becomes human. The Word of God takes our humanity completely as his own. And note what that says about humanity, about human life. Human life is embraced by God and taken onto himself completely. We say that Jesus is fully human and fully divine. That means that there is no aspect of your humanity, except for our love of wickedness, that Jesus hasn't taken onto himself. Note what that says. And so the incarnation is God doubling down on human dignity. And note, again, there's an element of the incarnation, again, where faith doesn't make a difference. He takes on the common humanity of all people. Whether they come to believe in him or not, he has taken their humanity onto himself. And this is one of the reasons the document is so strong on the universality of this. If we pay attention to what it is that Jesus has done, and we say that God became man, then that means God has taken the common humanity that we share with one another onto himself. It's not dependent on whether I believe it or recognize it. He didn't take the humanity of some onto himself. It's not like the Word became flesh and said, I am going to take the humanity of all of those who come to believe in me to myself. Because there is no such humanity as that. There's only the one humanity that God has created and that God has made. And it's this marvelous, marvelous moment where Jesus now, the Word made flesh, shows us quite literally and truly what it is to say that man is made in the image of God and after his likeness. Because now the life of God reaches out to the world in a human way, touches the world with a human hand, speaks to the world with a human voice. Note, God draws near in and through the humanity of Jesus. And in this humanity, then, it is Jesus who is preoccupied not with the mighty and the well-to-do, but with the wounded, the weak, the lost, the sick, the rejected. He casts the demon out of the possessed man. He touches the face of the unclean leper. He's the friend of those who have no moral dignity. Tax collectors, prostitutes, and sinners. Okay, well, I may not be a tax collector or a prostitute, but I certainly fit that last category. But note what we see with Jesus. He isn't looking first at the social dignity, the moral dignity, or the existential dignity of anybody as his reason for being there unless there's a lack of it. Because where there is something that is destroying the dignity of that life, that's the one he goes to. And so he takes away the wound to the existential dignity of the leper. He calls the tax collector to himself and the sinner to himself to restore the moral dignity to that life. He founds his church and orders it to care for the poor, to lift them out of those social threats to their dignity. Note how marvelous that is. Note how marvelous that is. And it's a completely different way of framing all of these familiar elements of our faith that we've grown up hearing about, grown up thinking about. And the church is now, in a sense, saying, look outward, in a sense, with the eye of God himself, who doesn't want any of his image to be lost. You know, you could almost imagine God deciding to save the world as all of his fallen images and going out to gather all of that back and restore it. And yet what we see in Jesus then, and note how Jesus saves us. Jesus saves us by dying an undignified form of death. He dies being accused of having no moral dignity. He's equated with a criminal. He suffers greatly in his body. Existentially, that basic dignity is taken from him. And yet, in the middle of all of it is the invincible dignity of the one who is truly the Son of God. And whatever the world does, it can never touch that. It can never destroy that. It can never take it away. The intrinsic dignity of the person that prevails in all circumstances. And this insistence then for the church, it's not that some lives are worth more defending than others. It's not that some lives are worth more support than others. There is an infinite dignity to all of them. And if then we want to speak about the difference between the believer and the unbeliever, if the believer's been given to recognize this, the believer has the obligation then to work with that, to move with that, to live and to act and to love in accordance with that. Paragraph 9 in the document. Again, we've already alluded to this, but it's worth looking at, where it begins its discussion on the rational character of man and how that's hardwired into us. But then later in the document is also going to remind us, but that doesn't mean that that is the source of our dignity, because then those who lose the ability to reason have lost their dignity, have lost their value. Likewise, the church is very skeptical of replacing the idea of human dignity with personal dignity, or the rights of man or human rights with personal rights. Because the problem in our modern age is personal tends to mean particular. And again, we define personhood around the ability to think, to choose, and to act. Well, that right away, that rules out the unborn child in the womb. Right away, that rules out that the mentally ill individual. Note again how right away we're cutting off categories of humanity. And the minute functionality is lost, dignity is lost. Secondly, the church is going to say this insistence on personal rights leads to, across the world, all kinds of contingent preferences and whims wanting to be elevated to the level of an absolute right, often at the expense of real human rights. And so everybody wants to make his life as he or her chooses and sees fit without the regard to anything in common with anybody else that limits me and that I have to respect. And this idea of limitless freedom accountable to no one, in the end, destroys the freedom of others, destroys the dignity of others. And so the church is going to say, isn't it amazing how there's this rush to claim new rights and to impose tremendous costs on societies for the sake of new rights, that in the end, as they're being promoted, trample upon the more fundamental rights that all people have. And so the church wants to keep using those terms: human rights, human dignity, meaning everyone has his or her unique dignity, but it is a dignity held in common with everybody else. And no one has more of it. And note how important it is. And that is the dignity we are called to uphold, to respect, to promote, and to defend. Not some lesser thing. And so it's a powerful, powerful statement. And note then, the church is going to say, then real human freedom rests on real human dignity and is at the service of that dignity. It's not simply an expression of it. It is best used in the service of real human dignity. So again, we'll unpack that next week, but it is important to kind of catch these directions that the church is moving in. And so, again, paragraph number 15. To clarify the concept of dignity even further, it is essential to point out that dignity is not something granted to the person by others based on their gifts or qualities, such that it could be withdrawn. Were it so bestowed, it will be given in a conditional and alienable way, and then the very meaning of dignity, however worthy of great respect, would remain exposed to the risk of being abolished. Instead, dignity is intrinsic to the person. It is not conferred subsequently, a posteriori. It is prior to any recognition, and it cannot be lost. So in other words, dignity is not something that someone gets later in life. Dignity is not something that somebody gets after he or she has done something or avoided doing something. Dignity is before all doing. As soon as there is life, there is dignity. And so they are intrinsically inseparable. Human dignity and human life cannot be decoupled from one another. For this reason, the Second Vatican Council speaks of the sublime dignity of the human person, who stands above all things and whose rights and duties are universal and inviolable. Intrinsic to human dignity are human rights and human duties. Our world is less comfortable with that. We like language of rights. We are less comfortable with language of responsibility and duty. But note, the duty to recognize the dignity of another person is a fundamental human duty. The duty to seek to grow in accordance with the dignity I've been given is a fundamental human duty. The duty to recognize that others likewise deserve that opportunity too is a fundamental human duty. There are varying ways those duties can be carried out, but it doesn't change the fact that if we're serious about what we're saying, they're part of the package. And, the church refers a number of times in this document to the Declaration on Human Rights. In fact, this is the 75th anniversary of that document. And St. John Paul II himself called it one of the most important statements of the human conscience ever made. It's not a church pronouncement, it's a secular pronouncement. But one of the things about it was it begins from this same starting point of recognizing the intrinsic, inalienable dignity of each and every human person. Because if we don't do that, it makes no sense to talk about fundamental human rights that cannot be taken away. that must be always respected. If dignity is contingent, so are the rights. And so again, the church is also then affirming something in the secular world. It's also saying, we've got a really good beginning here. Let's stop trying to rewrite it. Let's stop trying to qualify it. Let's stop trying to insert things into it that take our eyes off the main thrust of all of this, the inviolable dignity of every single human person. And so again, you have this remarkable statement from the church as well saying, we can work with this. We can work with this. Here's where we have something very strongly in common. And the church can say that because one of the things it also points out, and we'll wrap up with this, because it'll set the table for next week's conversation. One of the ways that Christianity changed the world is this. Prior to Jesus Christ, it was an exceedingly rare thing in any culture to see that the wounded, the sick, the criminal, the poor, the orphan were given any respect. You know, the biblical injunctions of care for the poor, the orphan, and the widow is something that is intrinsic to our faith tradition. And yet with Jesus, something new comes. Because you see it even in the older books of sacred scripture, the notion that serious illness, that grinding poverty somehow is a sign of divine disfavor on me. This is why we hear from time to time on late night television all of that bad preaching about double blessings and a gospel of prosperity, as if the sign that you're on God's good side is that you're doing well. And I don't know what that says for most of us who aren't doing so well. And so again, it's like, you know, let's be careful with that. And note how that kind of naive language of blessing, well-intentioned as it is, it writes most of us right out of the script. Something new comes with Jesus. Jesus privileged the sick. He went to them first, not second. Jesus privileged the poor. He went to them first, not second. Jesus privileged the outcast and went to him first, not second. That's what it means when he says, I left the 99 good sheep in the pen, and I went out looking for that one who wandered away. It makes no sense in worldly calculus. That's inefficient. That's a waste of time. You cut your losses and you move forward. The Lord doesn't work that way. And then, how does he redeem us? He literally, in his body, suffers all of the pain that our bodies feel. He literally, in his person, in his mind, in his emotion, undergoes all of the woundedness that we feel when we feel betrayed and rejected. And he dies. He embraces that fact of life which waits for all of us. And he dies. And when all of this happens, note what he's saying. Your suffering is so valuable, I'm going to use it to save the world. Your weakness is so valuable to me, I'm going to use it to save the world. Is that interesting? The Lord doesn't save the world by success, but by failure. The Lord doesn't save the world by health, but by woundedness. The Lord doesn't save the world by popularity, but by rejection. And in doing so, he is claiming it all for God and showing the face of God in and through it. So that after he rose from the dead, the church learned a new way of looking at the world. Because seeing the wounded Jesus suffering on the cross grafted itself into their minds and their hearts. And when they saw the wounded around them, they also saw him. They also saw him. And all of a sudden, beginning with the early Christian churches, there's a new form of value of the sick, of the physically broken, of the wounded and the incapable. They were given a dignity and treated with dignity in the middle of a world that wanted to put them aside and let them quietly die away. This is new. This is new. This did not exist in the world on any thinkable scale until Jesus rose from the dead. And until his church saw in the face of the suffering servant a face that they learned to recognize in the face of their suffering fellow human beings. Note how remarkable that is. This is why the Lord is so insistent. I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me to drink. I was naked and you clothed me. And note that this is not just you met my need, but you treated me with respect. And the beautiful part about that gospel reading is what the righteous say. Lord, we never saw you hungry. We never did that for you. We saw guys who were hungry and we fed them, but we didn't see you there. Which one were you? You know, it's this marvelous moment in the parable where you could almost see them saying, wait, here's the picture. We took a selfie. Which one are you? And Jesus is saying, all of them. All of them. Because the issue is not to see necessarily Jesus in that other person. The issue is to see the other person as Jesus does. And that's what he's teaching us there. You didn't see me at all. You didn't do it because you saw me. You did it because you looked at them like I look at them. And you did what I would do. And this is the thrust of this document, is in a sense training the Christian eye again to learn to look with the eye of Jesus. And then the final note is this: the church is going to insist on this, and this is going to be very important when we get to the back part of the document. The human body is not separable from the dignity of the human person. A human person is a union of body and soul. And so the human body must be treated with respect. And again, we live in a world that wants to abstract away from the body, And it's amazing in how many ways that expression, my body, my choice, can be used. It's amazing how many ways that destructive expression can be used. As if somehow my goodness, my character, and my dignity is somehow independent of it. And the church is going to insist, there is no such thing as a human person who doesn't have a human body, and who lives and acts as the image of God in and through a human body. And it matters. It matters. We are not an abstract mystical tradition which says the spiritual is important and the body doesn't matter. Because then why did the Lord have to take flesh? That's one of the other pieces. We cannot speak credibly about the dignity of the human person unless we also put on the table that involves the human body. It's not just the heart, it's not just the soul, it's not just the mind, it's not just what I'm feeling or thinking, but the simple fact of the matter is, to feel and think anything at all, I need a body anyway. So that is the other piece. We'll pick up on this next week, where we begin talking about the moral implications, the spiritual implications, the living implications of all of this.
Do you take questions?
Sure.
Okay.
As long as it's not a hard one.
No, okay. No, we always talk about every human being born into existence has an inner dignity and an inner worth. And we always say because they're made in the image and likeness of God. How would you define, like if someone asked me the question, what do you mean God, we're made in the image of God? What does that mean?
We'll cover that next week. Okay?
Okay.
No, that literally is something we're, but there's no single sentence answer to that, okay? So rather, let's frame it then. There is something unique. Okay, the first thing is this. We can speak of all created things as being manifestations of or indications of the rays of God's divine wisdom and creativity. Okay? All creation reveals or shows forth God in some way. And so the ancient expression is you can see the footsteps of the Creator in the things that He has made. Okay? However, there is something different about the human person. The world is not made in the image of God, but the human being is. Okay? And so the first element is just as God in a certain way, well, in a real way, is above the world, beyond the world, there is an element of what it is to be a human being that is above everything else in the world. We're not independent of everything else in the world. We can't live without it. But we are above it. And so, for example, there is a dignity about the human person that no animal possesses, that no other created thing possesses. There is a dignity about the human person that transcends the other things of the world. Okay? Just as God completely transcends the world. So there's an element of transcendence about us. There is something above or beyond everything else in the world. What is that? In part, it is the freedom that we have been given. Okay? We have a degree of freedom that no other element of creation has. And we have a responsibility that no other element of creation has. No other created thing is given responsibility for the care of all other created things. But we have been. That's part of the image and likeness of God, is the role that man has in the world. Just as God creates the world and cares for the world, He shares His care and governance of the world with humanity. One of the elements of being in the image of God is actually recognizing that and then acting accordingly. The other element is we are capable of knowing God and choosing. Third, we are capable of creative action. That's important too. We can't create out of nothing as God has done, but we can take the things He has given us and we can create with them. And freely chosen creativity is part of what it is, likewise, to be in the image of God.
Right. The reason that I ask it is because sometimes, like, if you take an individual who is severely disabled, and even severely cognitively challenged and limited, maybe even reduced to just staying in a bed.
Yeah.
And so someone would say, well, but yet they're made in the image and likeness of God.
Right. So now moving forward. Okay, so now moving forward through that, because you're right. And we don't want to stop our language of being in the image of God at that level, because note, is all those conditioned things I had already said can't be the ultimate ground of human dignity. Okay? And so that's very, very important. Next. Remember what I said about being able to see the footsteps of the Creator in the things that He has made. There is an element of what it is to be human which doesn't show the footsteps of the Creator. It shows the picture of the Creator. And that's important. And one way of thinking about it is to unpack what Jesus says in the gospel: whoever has seen me has seen the Father. One way of understanding that, and the common way, is if we look at what Jesus does, we know how God acts. Okay? There's another way of understanding that. If I really see Jesus, I don't just see what Jesus does. I see who he trusts. I see who cares for him. In other words, I don't look at Jesus healing the sick and saying, I've just seen God. That's true. But I can also look at Jesus in prayer and follow his gaze upward, and I can see the Father. I can look at Jesus and see that one who cares for him and who sustains him in the fact that he trusts someone. See the difference? And Jesus is also showing me the Father that way. And there's an element of what it is to be human, created in the image and the likeness of God, which is only recognizable at times when all of those other things fall away, when the creativity falls away, when the thinking, the choosing, the deciding, and the acting all fall away. I'm left with one that God wanted in the world, and that God sent here as a particular sign of his goodness. And beyond and deeper than any moral goodness is the fundamental goodness, his goodness, that God has given into that life. And that's probably the deepest element of the image of God. It's hard to describe, it's hard to tease out. But that's the thing. There's a fundamental goodness about the human person that is unlike any other goodness in the world. And it is a goodness that is a direct expression of the goodness of God himself. Tragically, we live in a world where we cover that over all the time. Tragically, we live in a world where we choose so much that isn't good that we make it hard to see that. But at base, when you take everything else away, take all the agency away, take all of that away, one is left with goodness. One is left with goodness. Yes?
You also look at it as, it's just occurring to me, that Jesus, when he was on the cross, had none of those freedom of movement or,
Mm-hmm.
it's like a picture of that, of his helplessness in that moment, which was a great salvific moment, but he let go, divested himself of most of those things like you were describing,
Yeah.
that person.
Mm-hmm.
It gives that dignity as well. I mean,
Yeah.
Right, because sometimes people, like if you look at people, if you just define your main image likeness of God, your ability to create,
Yeah.
to know and make choices, then people will say, well, look at this person who can, is just laying in bed like nothing, then we can
Right.
justify their
Exactly,
life and
exactly.
take their life.
Right. One of the things the church is going to say is that the image of God cannot be lost. And that even after the fall, and this is a real difference between Christian traditions. The Catholic and the Orthodox position on the fall is not that we lost the image of God. There are certain more radical streams of Christianity that would talk about the image of God being destroyed, which is a dangerous perspective. Right. We'll talk about it being wounded. We'll talk about it, a certain disfiguring of that image, not that the image is disfigured within us, but that our lives have been disfigured in such a way that it's hard to show it. But the church is going to insist the image of God remains in us after the fall. Man is good. And that's the other thing. Catholic theology is going to insist man is good after the fall, not evil. Wounded, disordered, off course, but good. So the fundamental goodness of the human person is not lost in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve fall. The fundamental goodness of the human person remains. And so note, human dignity is not destroyed by sin. It's violated, it's attacked, it's threatened, but it is not destroyed by sin. It cannot be erased. It's a good session. Thank you all for coming. The Lord be with you. May Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We keep getting questions like that. These are going to be good sessions.